This meeting is being recorded.
Excellent. All right. So we want to welcome Cindy Blanco, is a senior learning scientist at Duolingo, the world's most popular language learning app. Cindy has a PhD in linguistics, and her academic research focused on bilingualism in adults and children. At Duolingo, Cindy applies learning science to develop new ways to teach languages through technology. So I promised you all some fun. We've had a lot of educational things, and not that, what we're going to learn tonight is not educational, but we are definitely going to, we're going to focus on just having fun tonight and learning some, new ways of, hopefully improving your cognition, as well as, keeping what you have in a good place. So that being said, we welcome you, Cindy.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Wendy, and thanks everybody for joining. I just want to reiterate some things that Wendy said. One is that, I want this to be a lot of fun. I have some slides prepared. I'll share that so we can kind of see some. I have different points and a lot of questions that I'm going to kind of quiz you on some things. But we don't, this is about you tonight. We don't have to get through all my slides. So I would really love for you to stop me where you want to hear more, if you have questions or you need me to repeat something. And like Wendy said, my background is in linguistics. I have been a little language nerd since as long as I can remember. I've studied lots of different languages, and then I did a lot of research on how people learn languages at different ages. So especially comparing infants with kids and with adults. So I'm happy to talk about any of those things. We don't have to stick to what's in the presentation, but it's just a place for us to start. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, do you see this blue screen here? I get a nod, that's perfect. Great. So we're going to talk about all different kinds of language learning things. And like Wendy said, I work for Duolingo. And in case you're not familiar with Duolingo, it's a language learning app. It's totally free. You can download it on your phone or an iPad. There's also just a website that you can use to study over 40 languages. So you can choose which language you want to study, and we have some things that you might expect, like Spanish and French, and we have some less commonly studied languages like Scottish Gaelic or Hungarian and Finnish. So there's all kinds of languages available. And something I think is really important is that all of the content is totally free. So you're not charged for any of these courses. You can study as much as you want, as many languages as you want. And something else that we focus on at Duolingo is using gamification. So to incorporate fun, right into the learning experience. I already told you that I am definitely a language nerd, but even saying that, there were plenty of times that I was not enjoying the language classes that I took in middle school or high school or college. And, there were some things that were fun, but there are other things that just felt like bland worksheets, or filling in the blanks. And so Duolingo really tries to make the whole experience of learning a language really fun. And also, especially our biggest courses, the ones that are most advanced, most developed, are aligned to these international standards. And so you really can learn from them. We recently did some research that found that if you complete 5 units in one of the biggest courses, like our Spanish course or our French course, that you learn the equivalent of studying for 4 semesters in college. So if you stick with it, you really can learn. But that's probably what I'm going to say through the whole talk. Language learning takes a really long time. So you just have to stick with it. This is just, again, this is the only time in the talk I'm going to talk about Duolingo. If you have questions, we can talk about it, but the Duolingo part kind of ends here. This is an example screen in one of the courses. And so this is what it looks like for people who are studying Spanish. You kind of work through all these different bubbles, these colorful bubbles about different topics, and you do lessons on the topic, and then you can move on to the next row. And so you can keep scrolling the screen, and it goes on for rows and rows. The content gradually gets harder, covers all different kinds of topics. And you'll see kind of regular lessons, but we also have like little short stories that are like cute little dialogues between characters. There's lessons that focus on listening. There are lessons that focus on grammar. We also have podcasts. If you're a podcast listener, that are aimed for learners. So if you're someone who's learning Spanish, you could listen to a podcast that's mostly in Spanish, but it's like easy Spanish. It's like made for learners, and there's lots of English in it to help explain some things. And as I said,
pronunciation.
Yes.
Pronunciation.
Yes. So in the lessons, let me see, do I do in the next slide? Not really. Yeah. So in our regular lessons, you'll sometimes be prompted to repeat a sentence or answer something, and you actually like speak to the phone, right? You're just speaking to the technology, and it automatically grades your speech. And so I really like this because a lot of people have like apprehension about kind of speaking a new language. And so sometimes it's a lot more comfortable to get used to speaking just to your phone or just to the computer. So yeah, there's lots of pronunciation exercises, and the lessons do this automatic grading. So it'll tell you, well, you pronounced this word okay, but this is the word that you didn't pronounce so well. Great. Yeah, pronunciation is really important. That's actually what I did most of my research on, was on pronunciation. So I love it. Let's keep talking about it. Great. And so here are some examples of the kinds of lessons you might see, these little exercises in the app. And so you can see here's one in German, and you press these little, these words to complete a sentence, or you might listen and have to type the sentence. The audio lessons, you can see some of these different topics that they cover. The audio lessons also do a lot of pronunciation, a lot of responding. So that one, you talk a lot to yourself in the app. And here's one of these little short stories on the side there. Okay, so that's about Duolingo. And like I said at the start, especially maybe if you've just joined, I'm just going to tell you some of the things that I think are kind of most amazing about how language in the brain works. Stop me if you have questions. I could chat about this stuff all day, but I'll kind of, again, like this is a starting point, some things we could talk about, and we can take the conversation wherever you want to go from here. So the first thing that I really want you to know, and to leave this chat knowing and believing, is that everyone can learn new languages. And it doesn't matter your educational background, how old you are, whether you've studied a language before, whether you're coming back to it after maybe, something you studied in high school a long time ago. And really the most challenging thing for adults learning a new language is staying motivated, because it takes a long time, and to get the right kind of practice and like interaction with the language. And so it's true that like learning lots of things gets more difficult as you get older, but it's not always for the reasons that people think. Like there are definitely changes in your brain that make things a little bit harder, a little bit slower to learn. But when it comes to language, there's also just so many fewer opportunities for adults to get the right kind of practice and intense practice. And I think it's a really good comparison to think about kids. That if you can think about like a 5-year-old, a 5-year-old can say a lot of things. Like we're all English speakers here. And so if you imagine, a 5-year-old knows tons of things in English. But they also say some wacky things, or they might still say things like, I go to the store. There's like all kinds of things that kids are still figuring out. They don't know a lot of words. They also don't know a lot of rules about like what's okay to say or what's kind of rude, right? Kids often don't have much of a filter. And so if you think about like, well, how old does a kid have to be before they're not kind of making those mistakes, or they really know most words? And it might not be until like, I might say like 7 or 8, until they're like really good conversation partners maybe. And, this changes. Some kids are older, some kids are a little bit later. But But man, if it takes them 7 years to learn one language, like, of course it takes you a long time. Of course that's really hard. Not to mention if you're an adult, you're busy, you have a family to take care of and jobs and responsibilities and bills and things. So kids who have the best chance of learning a language, they have it easy. They don't have to worry about bills and work. And even then it takes years. It takes a really long time. So I think sometimes adults can be really hard on themselves. Learning a new language is a hard thing to do. It's going to take time. And even the best little learners take years and years to figure it all out. So be gentle on yourself. So here I just want to kind of say out loud, because this gives us some more ideas of things we could talk about, that when linguists or, those of us working at Duolingo think about all of the things you have to learn in a new language, here's kind of the list of those things. So if you think about the actual stuff you have to learn in a new language, you have to learn the pronunciation of the language. You have to learn how to understand the different sounds, but also say the different sounds. So there's 2 parts of pronunciation there. Of course, you have to learn tons of new words. You also have to learn grammar, how to put those words together. And then there's rules of conversation, what is appropriate in a given circumstance. So in English, you could imagine that it's perfectly grammatical to say, give me the pen. But in some cases, in some circumstances, it could be a little rude to just say, give me the pen. You might not want to say that to your boss, hurriedly in a meeting, or you could imagine that sounding really mean, that in English, it's okay grammatically to say, give me the pen. But depending on the situation, it might be more appropriate to say oh, would you mind passing me the pen? So knowing not just what is grammatical, but what's appropriate. So that's the stuff you have to learn. And then there's the things that you do with a new language. And so we break them down into these 4 groups: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And so when you see it all kind of laid out, this list of all the stuff, you can imagine that it's only natural that you wouldn't learn all of the parts at the same rate. Some things are much easier to learn, and some things are much harder. So if you think about that list of what you have to learn, for adults, vocabulary is often pretty easy to learn. We're pretty good at memorizing vocabulary. And it's something that we do even in English, well into adulthood. We're still learning new words all the time. I'm sure this isn't always true at Duolingo, where there's so many really young people. But, I can remember when it didn't make sense to say that you could friend somebody. That friend wasn't a verb. But now if I say, oh, well, maybe we should friend each other later, you know what I mean. But 20, 30 years ago, it didn't make sense to friend someone. You might make a friend or befriend or become friends. But now we've learned this new word, to friend, or to Google something. I remember when you couldn't say to Google something, but now we have learned this new word. So vocabulary learning is often pretty easy for adults because we still are doing it all the time. For adults, learning new pronunciations, how to control your mouth and get your tongue to say new sounds in a language, that can be a lot more difficult. So, right, if you think about all of these boxes that you have to check, you kind of go faster learning some and a little bit slower learning others. And the same is true with skills. I bet in this list, I bet some of these feel more intimidating, even in English, than others, right? People often report that reading and writing feel less pressure than listening and speaking, because you don't have to do it in the moment. You can take a minute to kind of review, right? We do this probably even with text messages and letters and emails, that you have a chance to revise and think through what you want to say. But when you're speaking in the moment, you kind of don't get that chance to have a second thought about it. So speaking often feels there's more pressure there. for those skills. And so as you progress learning a language, including your first language, again, some of these you'll move faster, some of them you'll need more practice. And so this is something else I want you to think about. Like, again, be gentle with your expectations. Some of these are just inherently easier, some are inherently harder, and probably no one is going to be great at all of these at the beginning or even after a while. Okay, so that's the list. I've told you it's all so hard. Maybe you believe me. I don't know if any of you have studied languages before, or if it was a long time ago, or how that felt. But I hear at work when I've interacted with people who are using the app that it does feel hard. Okay, so why does it feel that hard? And there's plenty of reasons. One of the reasons is that some parts of language, even like I said for English, you have been learning not just for your whole life, but even before you were born. So some parts of language you start hearing at the end of the third trimester. So when you're still in utero. And so if you can imagine your little baby body in utero, you start hearing the rhythm of your mother's language. And so you start learning some pronunciation patterns of your language by the time you were born. And so there have been experiments that are done on like 4-hour-old babies. And I have to think that the parents who are turning over their 4-hour-old babies like must be researchers, right? Like, I don't know how hard it is to convince people to like, plug in little earphones to your 4-hour-old baby. But there's differences in the brain and the baby's attention to their own language, the language that they've been hearing through their mother's womb, compared to other languages. So some of this language work, your brain has been absorbing for longer than, your birth date, longer than you've been alive. There's also tons of muscle memory that you've acquired your whole life. You've been working on being an English speaker, getting your tongue and your lips and your jaw to move in certain ways. And you really are using muscles, right? And so the same way that you might train at the gym or train to play soccer or something, you've been training your muscles to move in very particular ways for your whole life. And so now when you have to really wrestle with them to get them to move in different ways, it's really hard and not impossible. But of course, that I think when you think about it in this context as a muscle, you've created this muscle memory for your whole life for certain movements, for Englishy movements. And there's, you can see and think about your lips and jaw and things, but the same is happening in your brain, that these connections between ideas and meanings and sounds and grammar, all those things that we listed out before, you have been strengthening those connections in your brain also since the time you were an infant and a toddler, kind of first really forming those connections. And that's really hard to overwrite too. So this is kind of what we're up against when we're learning a new language, which is why it's really important, right, to get lots of practice, lots of opportunities to use and hear and see the language, because you're trying to undo a lot of what you've been training your brain to do for your whole life. And that's why if you have tried to study a language before and it feels hard or maybe too hard, it's not just you. It is hard for everyone. And again, if you think about all those different skills and the things that you have to learn for a new language, some things will come easier, some will be harder, but there's a reason why it's hard and it's not just you. I've often heard people say, well, I'm not good at learning a language. And kind of from a brain perspective, you're not that special. No one's that special. Your brain is really built for learning languages, and you've already done it once before, right? So all the equipment is there. Your brain knows how to do it. You probably just don't have enough opportunities because, like we said, you're a busy grown-up who doesn't get to immerse yourself for your entire life for 7 or 8 years. So of course, it's hard work to have to reprogram your brain. And I think I have one more brain slide and then I'll pause and see if there's anything you want to chat more about yet. So the core of learning is building these connections, right? So we're going to think about the brain for a minute. And so if you are an English speaker, like I am, for a long time now, I've been associating certain meanings, certain ideas with like their English word. So if you can imagine like a small furry creature that meows, the word we use in English for this is cat, right? And I probably learned cat. I mean, we had cats when I was growing up, so I probably learned it really early, maybe a year and a half, 2 years old. So there's a really strong connection in my brain between the sounds cat and this idea that we have of like what a cat is. And so you can think of that connection as being really strong. Now, when you start learning a new language, like when I start learning Spanish, that connection isn't going to be there, right? The Spanish word is gato. And I have to build this new connection. And so this is kind of a little diagram I like to use that like, okay, I have this idea in my head and this really strong connection to the English word cat. And like I said, when you first start learning Spanish, you have to start building these connections. And so what does our brain do? Our brain is trying to do what's easiest. Our brain is all about being efficient, working fast. And so the most natural thing is like you do this translating in your head. And if you're someone who has studied a language, right, like you can almost feel yourself doing this. Like you think, okay, I want to say cat. Word is cat. What's the Spanish for cat? Oh, right, gato. And so you kind of feel your brain jumping through these connections. But in order to become a good speaker of the language, you need to work on that direct connection, which is why it's so important to have opportunities to practice in different ways, to see it in writing, to hear it being spoken, to have to say it yourself, to really build that stronger connection. And so your goal might be to have to do less translating in your head and to eventually get that kind of stronger connection. I like to have visuals. I thought I'd throw that one in. So we've talked a lot about how hard it is, and it is, but again, it's not impossible. There are lots of things that you can do to help yourself learn a language. And here are some things that I recommend. I think the first one that's really important is to set meaningful goals that you can accomplish in the short term. I don't at all recommend saying like, well, I want to be fluent in Spanish by the end of the year. That is a huge goal. We talked about how it takes kids, maybe as many as 7 or 8 years to become like competent English speakers. That's too big, too hard a goal. And it's really hard to feel that progress. And you can end up feeling really disappointed or just kind of down on your progress. I think what's better is to find things that are really meaningful to you. Like maybe you want to be able to like have the beginning of a conversation with your neighbor who speaks Spanish. Like maybe you want to do that before you go back to school, before school starts again and the kids are back in school. Okay, because that's something like you can measure. You can kind of check that box in your head. You know what it means to say, hey, good morning, have a nice day. And it's not that far in the future. And that way, when you are able to check that box and kids go back to school, you can set the next short-term goal. Well, now I want to be able to ask them how their day at school was. And maybe that's my goal by Christmas, to be able to ask some questions. So you kind of set these like short-term goals that are really about what you want to do with the language. And like I said, it could be like, you want to chat with the neighbor kid. Maybe you have a trip coming up. I'm studying Italian right now because I'm going to Italy with my family. And so I just want to like feel good enough in Italy to kind of help order things in a restaurant. I don't need to sound like a smooth politician. I don't need to sound like an orator or a poet or anything. I just want to like have a good time and kind of feel good about like ordering. I want to be able to order what I want when I go to that restaurant. So short, meaningful goals. I would start with small things. I would also encourage you to look for like, there's so many free resources now online with apps like Duolingo, but also on YouTube. And we'll talk about some other things that you could do that if you're someone who's interested in learning a language, I would not start right away with like, some of these courses can cost hundreds of dollars, even more than that. Like first, figure out what you like, figure out what motivates you and engages you. And there's so much free stuff out there, podcasts and YouTube and websites and apps. Start there, get a feel for what you like and what you might be looking for before you pay what could be a lot of money. I also recommend building study habits like into your existing schedule and the stuff that you already do. So if you're someone who like always has a morning coffee, maybe you pair a little bit of studying with your morning coffee, and it doesn't have to be an hour, but maybe that's a chance where you do whatever it is you like to do, whether it's podcasts or lessons or looking at a web page. Maybe it's something you like to do right before bed, or where you're waiting to pick someone up from an appointment. Like figure out what your schedule is like and fit in those study habits like right into what you're doing anyway. Similarly, I would say take advantage of your hobbies. So if you're someone who really loves music, or you always have music on in the background, maybe look for music in the language that you want to study. And that way you're just like casually incorporating it in ways that you like anyway. Music is really catchy. It's a great way to like kind of get some of those phrases and words in your head in a way that you enjoy. If you're someone who loves to cook, maybe you try recipes from, either from that culture or eventually in the language itself. And that way you're learning food words and cooking words, things that you care about. So think about like, well, what are your interests and how can you build in these easy and free ways? I think it's also really helpful for motivation to find ways to make learning social. And that could mean a lot of different things to different people. So like in Duolingo, people can like follow each other, kind of friend each other on the app. And so you can kind of get notes that might say like, oh, well, Cindy just completed a lesson, and you could give them a high five. And so I could see, oh, well, Wendy completed a lesson. I can, kind of respond to her that way. So some people are really motivated like that. There's also like lots of learner communities where you can do like these virtual meetups. Duolingo has some of those too, that for people who really like this kind of social experience, you can do this, but with learners to practice in kind of a safe setting where you're maybe you don't feel as like pressured to perform as when I'm going to be in Italy trying to order in a restaurant, but you can do it like casually with other learners. So think about ways that you can make learning social. And the last thing I'll say here is that, when you're thinking about those short-term goals, think about what you need to know in a language. Do you need to be super highly proficient and sound like a professor? Or is it okay to be conversational, depending on what you want to do with the language? And even the act of learning, the act of doing this kind of regular studying with something like language learning, because it's building those connections, even just trying to learn benefits your brain. And so there have been studies that show these kinds of cognitive benefits after just 4 months of study, right? And no one's fluent in 4 months. So it's not that these people are like really highly proficient or impressing people with their amazing language. It's just that act of studying and building those new connections in your brain that really has these positive impacts. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I talked so much. Let's see if you have any questions or more things you want to chat about before we keep going.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
I don't have my, oh, there. Can you see me?
Yes, hi.
Hi, I have been doing Duolingo French now for over 2 years. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm getting really good because I don't know how many. I guess there's like 5 lessons in that beginner one. Like the first year I got really far, and then for some reason I disconnected or got rid of the app and then I
Oh,
put it back on.
yeah.
So I had to start all over again.
Oh,
So I'm back going through it again and going really good. And and listening to you, you're so right, because there's some things that I just can't get.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah.
Go over and over and over and even write it down. like you're right about the vocabulary, because I started taking French in like seventh grade, seventh, eighth grade, and then I think I took a little break in ninth grade. Then I picked it back up in a sophomore in high school. Um, so I had that little bit, and then I didn't like really pick it up again until a few years ago. And then, like I said, 2 years ago when my grandson, he was doing Spanish on Duolingo,
Mhm.
and we were, I said I can't do Spanish, and I tried that. But do you have any more recommendations for them places that I feel more stuck than others?
Mhm.
Like you were
Mhm.
mentioning, I mean, what can I do for those?
Yeah. So some things that you could do. I mean, I like this idea that you mentioned about like writing things down. So something that helps with learning is to have to process it, to kind of like slow yourself down and make you and your brain kind of like break it apart. And so I like the idea of like writing it down. Something that works for some people is to like also maybe take screenshots of sentences that were hard or words that they want to practice. And so you can kind of see those in a place. There's also more that we're doing in other parts of the app. So I work a lot on the Duolingo blog, and we just did a series of posts about French. And so there's like lots of tips and things that we're putting in other parts of like kind of this Duolingo world that will eventually be getting into the app with more tips for pronunciation or like grammar points. We just did a big post about French spelling with, I don't know if anybody here besides Marie has studied, spelling in French is tough. Yeah, I don't know. I hope you can all see. Yeah, right. We did a post on the accents recently too, what they mean, how to understand them. And so you're right that there's so many different parts of things that you have to learn that I like the idea of writing things down. I think, again, with like the comfort of an app, like repeating things out loud really helps. Again, you're kind of slowing things down and making your brain break it apart. So if you get one of those sentences that's challenging or that like maybe you have to do a couple times before you get it right, you can kind of like if you speak it out loud, this is like you're engaging with it in another way. Something that I don't know if you have seen, Marie, let me get back to it. So on your screen, yours will look a little different. This is a Spanish course. We have these tips. I don't know if you've seen this before.
I saw that.
Yeah, so they are like these short explanations of kind of behind the scenes a little bit, what's happening, like what is the rule about the thing you're about to learn. And we're testing right now doing even more things with those tips. So expanding them, getting them in more places in the app so that when you realize like, okay, I get the vocabulary, but man, that verb is driving me crazy. Here is where we'll have more information about that verb. Like this is actually what's happening, and French verbs are a little wacky. So there'll be a lot of ones about verbs there.
Okay.
Those are some
All right,
ideas.
Thank you.
Mhm. Does anyone else have things you want to chat about right now?
Any other questions? Feel
When
free.
I was, when the part that you said about, being able to apply, in the lingo, the common lingo and stuff
Mhm.
like that. Well, I had, I was in France, and, I thought it was real cool if I wanted to get somebody's attention, I would say, garçon, garçon. And then I didn't know it at the time. I had no idea at the time. I didn't learn it till afterwards. That was like being like really derogatory. I had no idea.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because like, right, garçon is a perfectly good French word and you're saying it
Yes,
perfectly
right.
well.
Yeah.
But it's like it's this situational stuff that's also really important. Sometimes more important than the grammar, right? Sometimes just like knowing the right word. That's funny.
I have to say, I even see that. I have a sister-in-law from England, right? And I just assumed that people from England had this, we speak English, right? But we do not.
right.
Totally. And even the dialects, Cindy, from my niece I was sharing with you that lives near, in Brooklyn, she is married to somebody who's his mom is from Mexico. So we went there, they got married and had the reception in Puerto Vallarta. And just talking to his family, how different, the West Coast to the East Coast with the dialect is. Like they were very insulted if you think they're all the same. We all speak the same Spanish, and it's very different. So the dialects in itself are so different, even like within the United States, right? The Pittsburgh Ease accent, Boston accent. So I find that that's very interesting. And, I would imagine that's like that in other languages as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's a really great point. So like, even if you know the lots of words and the right place to say them, it's appropriate, then you show up in a place where that's not even the word that's used, so I wonder how often it happens that there's like high school exchange students who've been studying English, they've got really good English, and then they do an exchange in Pittsburgh, and the first time they might hear someone say yins, like what must they think? They kind of did all this studying, all the different terms, maybe they've heard y'all on movies or in songs and things. And then you show up and you're like, man, I don't even know what they're saying. I know that's definitely happened to me. I speak Spanish. Part of my family is Spanish speaking. And I was recently in South America for work, and just, I was traveling with a group of Duolingo people who were from Mexico and Argentina. And in all the different countries, we'd all have to like huddle together and figure out the menus, because nobody's words are the same, right? It's one language. And this, this happens with England too. I don't know if you can think of examples like eggplant in England is aubergine, and a courgette in England is what we call zucchini. And so can you imagine like getting in front of a menu and you have to translate it?
Absolutely. It's very interesting for sure. No doubt. Anybody else have any questions or thoughts?
Okay, well, I'm going to keep going, and we can come back to that. If you think of a question or you want to get back to that, what we're going to do in the next section is I have, because Duolingo it's the most downloaded education app in the world. We have tons of learners all over the world. And so I can look at the data and figure out what people are studying in different countries, what the different trends and patterns are. And so I'm going to share some of that with you now, but I'm going to make you guess. So if you want to unmute eventually or enter it in the chat, we're going to start by, so like I said, we have over 500 million learners on Duolingo. And so we can ask lots of questions about what people are doing in different places. The first question is, I want us to guess, what are the top 5 languages studied in the US? So people in the US, what are the top languages they're studying? Oh, I can see Janet saying Spanish. Okay, Spanish is a guess. That is on the list. You are correct. What other top languages do you imagine?
Japanese, Russian.
Oh, wait, who said Japanese? Oh, interesting. We're going to talk about it. Japanese is in the top 5 in the US.
Wow.
He also says French.
Chinese.
Interesting. Chinese is not. Oh, sorry. Say again. I think I might have talked over someone. Spanish, French, and Japanese are up there. We're missing 2.
German.
German is up there. Italian recently got bumped off the list by Japanese. It's number 6 now. It's not that far down the list. There's one that we're missing. Let's see. English was the one that we're missing.
Oh.
There's so many people in the US studying English that it reaches number 2, even the number 2. So on Duolingo, the way the courses work is that they're really specific, like to the language that you know. So we don't have one Spanish course. We have like a bunch of Spanish courses. We have a Spanish course for English speakers. We have a Spanish course for German speakers, Spanish course for Portuguese speakers, right? And they're all a little different. right? An English speaker needs to know kind of like different things, or you'll make different kinds of mistakes. And the same is true for English. We have 22 different English courses. And so people in the US from these 22 different languages are studying English. Now, globally, the top 5 languages globally are pretty similar. Oh, say again, I spoke over someone again. So let's take a look. There'll be more questions on the next page that I'll need volunteers. So when we think about the whole world, English is the most commonly studied language around the world. Spanish is number 2. French is number 3. And German and Japanese round out the top 5. Okay, so now I have more questions. These are surprises. There's 5 of them here. We'll go one by one. First question is, this is not about Duolingo, but just in general, about how many languages are there in the world? Does anyone know this little stat?
I'm going to take a guess at 110.
110. Okay. Do we have, I feel like it's The Price is Right, right? Anyone want to go higher or lower? So the answer is over 7,000.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And so, and Duolingo teaches 41. So we got a ways to go, right? There's a lot more to do. And so if you think there's some places that are like especially linguistically dense, where there's tons of languages, and India is a place like this, that there's just, for the size of, I mean, India is extremely populous, right? But there's tons and tons of languages, maybe even, but I don't even want to give numbers because I'll be wrong. But in India and then in Southeast Asia through the Pacific Islands, there's tons of languages. And a lot of these languages are only spoken maybe on one small island or by one particular community. So of course, like the languages that we were listing for those top 5 or top 10 languages, they're languages we've all, heard of. We guessed them all. You already guessed them all. But there are just so many really small languages throughout the world. Okay, next question. Among Duolingo learners, what is the number one reason that people in the US say they're studying a language?
Travel.
Travel, okay. Anyone else?
Maybe to communicate with other family members.
Who said that? Was that Wendy?
Was.
Wendy, you win.
Oh,
yes.
Wow. Really?
So yes, yeah. So especially if you think about the last 2.5 years, right? Travel really took a hit. And so we see that before the pandemic, travel would make, in the US, travel might make up like 15% of learners would say that the real reason they want to study was for travel. But of course, that took a hit during the pandemic. And so last year, for the first time, surpassing work and surpassing school was family, that people more than ever want to study languages to connect with family. And there's kind of two parts to this family reason, I think. One is that people want to connect with like actual relatives, right? Maybe they have in-laws or grandkids that are learning another language or already speak another language. But a lot of people are studying on Duolingo because of heritage languages, family languages, that their family came from Wales, and so they want to study Welsh, or their family came from Japan and they wish they knew more Japanese. And so people are using language learning as ways to connect with their own heritage. Next question. What is the most popular language studied in Ireland? What is the number one language that people in Ireland are studying?
Wow.
Gaelic.
Who said this?
Mary Beth.
I did not plant these questions. This is the first time anyone has seen this presentation. Yes, that Irish Gaelic is the number one language that people in Ireland are studying. 2 years ago, it surpassed Spanish for the first time. And this, I think, is so interesting. It kind of started at the pandemic that, right, like if you remember early in the pandemic, all of a sudden our lives were upended, our schedules and kind of our daily habits really dramatically changed. And people started studying languages for these really personal reasons. You know, family is an example of that. And for many people in Ireland, it was an opportunity to kind of dig in and learn Irish. You know, there are parts of Ireland where Irish is more widely spoken than others. And so people around the country used it as an opportunity to like maybe do this thing they've been meaning to do, which was connect with their country, connect with their culture, and learn Irish. Okay, we're wrapping up the quiz. What in most years is the fastest growing language in the world?
Spanish.
Spanish. Anybody else? The answer is Korean.
Wow.
That there is huge growing interest in Korean. And so there's a couple ways to think about this. One is that Spanish is a huge language, right? We saw that globally, it's the #2 language that people are studying. And it's, I think when you're that big, it's hard to get like dramatically bigger. So that's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is that year over year, there has just been this like enormous increase in people wanting to study Korean. This is especially true of young learners. This is especially true. It's not quite as true in the US. In the US, the fastest growing language is Japanese. But in most of the rest of the world, the fastest growing language is Korean. And there's been like a real rise in interest in like K-pop and Korean music. It's really easy now to find like Korean TV shows called K-dramas. They're like what is the word? Soap operas. I was thinking of the word in Spanish, right? Remember the words being connected? I couldn't get my connection back. Lots of Korean soap operas. And if you remember, do you remember like that Squid Game kind of craze in September, October last year, that people are starting to connect like their other interests with language learning? So every time a different episode of Squid Game like was coming out, those weeks at the end of September, there'd be a huge jump in people studying Korean. And so in most years, Korean has been the fastest growing language to study. But this year's been different. This year, what has been the fastest growing language on Duolingo? Did someone say something? What big global event is still happening, but started earlier this year?
The pandemic.
Not the pandemic.
Russian. What about Russian?
So you're thinking the right way. The fastest growing language this year has been Ukrainian. And this is true in the US, this is true in the UK, it's true in Mexico, it's true in Peru, it's true in Argentina, that the fastest growing language is Ukrainian. And so what has happened is that as Ukrainian has grown, because of the politics and the optics, right, the way people are perceiving Ukraine and Russia, there's been a drop in Russian learners around the world, that people are kind of using. Again, I think this is part of like the same pattern of people using language to connect with things that they care about, whether it's family, whether it's music and entertainment, that they want to study the language of Ukraine and are kind of feeling uncomfortable, I would say, about studying Russian. Mm-hmm. And I say that as someone who minored in Russian. So like, ooh, there's a lot there. Yeah. Okay, so that was my quiz. Now I'm just going to show you some things that are fun to look at, and we can go back to them. So the most recent data that I have, we do this at Duolingo. We do this yearly kind of summary of language learning trends. We do it at the end of the year, so we haven't done it for 2022 yet. But you can see this is last year's map of the most popular language studied on Duolingo in each country. And so yellow countries are places where Spanish is #1. You can see just how much of the world, I think it's 120 countries where English is the #1 language. There's also lots of French or countries choosing French as the most popular language. But the whole list is becoming a lot more varied, a lot more diverse. That Swahili shows up here, Irish, of course, in Ireland. It's hard to see here, easy to see in numbers. Swedish is the most popular language to study in Sweden. Korean has grown to #1 in Mongolia. That you can kind of just see the diversity here. We can definitely come back to this slide, but just in the interest of time, I'm going to go to the next one, which is the second most popular language. I think this is really interesting, especially because so much of the world kind of needs to study English for economic or school reasons. Sometimes you can find really interesting trends when you look at the second most popular. So after you get English out of the way, now what's happening? And so you can see a real variety in languages here. I'm going to stop here. It is just about 7 o'clock. I don't have to run out the door. So I'm happy to stay on and chat more about any questions that you have.